On in and get our class started. Ricky, would you lead us in a word of prayer to start this class, please? Thank you, Ricky. Okay, we're in Luke chapter 9, and we're going to pick up in starting at verse 18, where Tim got through last week, the first 17 verses, where Jesus sends the 12 out to go out into the towns and throughout all the towns preaching the gospel and healing everyone that they come across. And also we see that when they return back in, we have the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, or 5,000 plus, more than likely, that we got into Tim covered last week. And so we've come to a critical part of Jesus's ministry here on earth. We see immediately following the miraculous feeding of this multitude that we talked about last week, we have Peter's great confession that we all are familiar with here of who Christ is at Caesarea Philippi. We'll probably look back, I'll be referring back to Matthew chapter 16. That is the parallel to Luke 9 here. And Matthew gives us a lot more detail into that confession that we're more familiar with than what Luke does here on that. But we see the last thing we talked about was the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Do you think that feeding of the 5,000 with the 5 loaves and the 5 fishes, that opened the eyes of the disciples of the 12 a little bit more than what was already happened so far? Yeah, after they'd been about, here they come back in, and here's this great, it says 5,000 men, but it's like Tim referred to last week, that could have been 5,000 men and 5,000 women, and there could have been a great multitude of people there that was fed with 5 loaves of bread and 5 small fishes. So that probably really opened their eyes up to see the glory of Christ, the glory of Jesus as God's anointed one. This incident here that we're fixing to study, the transfiguration, Peter's confession, that is acknowledged by a lot of folks and by most that this was a crucial turning point. You might say it was a watershed moment in the teaching of Christ, in his teaching of ministry to particularly the 12 that he's chosen. Up to this point, Christ has been patiently teaching them, leading them to appreciate who he is, what he can do through them and in them. But now it's like he's reached that goal because he just sent them out. He just sent them out to go about teaching in his name, to preaching, to healing. And so he's kind of reached that goal. And from this point on in the life of Christ, his goal is to get to the cross. That's where he immediately turns. He starts directing everything to the cross because he starts speaking of his death, the coming death. It's like it's impending. It's right around the corner. And so he begins to direct them and their attention to what is coming, to get to the cross and to that point. And so we begin here in verse 18. And the goal is maybe we'll get through verse 36, 37, but we'll see. Because there's a lot here in this that we need to talk about or can talk about. And it happened as he was alone praying, and we know this is something that Christ did a lot, that his disciples joined him. And he asked them, saying, "Who do the crowd say that I am?" So Jesus has fed the 5,000 plus. He's went alone and had some time to pray. And he's praying. And no doubt, I feel like he was probably praying for his disciples and for God to begin to give them the understanding of what he's fixing to tell them and what's fixing to take place and what's happened. Because we see he was alone a lot of times. We'll see it in the Transfiguration we'll get to here shortly, that he was alone praying then. But he begins with a very personal, impersonal question, very simple question. He says, who do the crowd say that I am? Who do men say that I am? Was that a difficult question for them to answer? When he said, who does people say that I am? That was probably an easy answer, wasn't it? Very easy answer. Because everywhere they went, they just went all around the region, teaching, preaching. The name of Jesus was on everybody's tongue. Everybody was talking about Jesus. He was the buzz of the town. He was the buzz of the area. Everything that was being said. There was a dozen verdicts going around about who he was. Who was this man? All kinds of rumors, opinions were probably in the air. Everywhere they went, they were probably being asked, who is this? Well, we think he's this. He was on every tongue. They were not only saying things about Jesus, they were saying great things about him. Talking about what he had done, what they had seen, what they had heard. So what was the common knowledge that people thought he was? John the Baptist. John the Baptist. Even Herod, Elijah. Some said that he was John the Baptist, brought back from the dead. Some said that he reminded them of Elijah. Others thought about Jeremiah, even though Luke doesn't say that here. He says, so they answered and said John the Baptist, but some say Elijah. Others say that one of the old prophets has risen again. I think you go back to Matthew 16, and Matthew refers to some that say that Jeremiah has come back. In other words, their current opinion was unanimous as to Jesus, was by no means unanimous. What was unanimous about it? That he was someone who was what? He was a great man. He was a great man, doing great things, great works. That was unanimous. He was more than just your ordinary man that had come along at this time. Did they see him as the Messiah? No, they didn't, did they? They see him as a human. Just another great man in the line of prophets. That's what they seen. He was just another man who they realized he spoke with the authority of God. But he was just, had his place among all those great heroes of Elijah, Jeremiah, Moses. That's how the crowds thought of him as just another one of those. Who was the one thing that we notice here in these 3 verses that he didn't ask who they thought he was? You notice that? He said, who does the crowd and the multitude say that I am? Then they answer. And then we're going to see in verse 20, he'll go straight to them and he'll say, who do you say that I am? But who does he not ask they say that I am? You ever notice that? Who's he skip over? The Jewish leaders. He didn't ask who the Jewish leaders is. Because if you go to John chapter 11, it's pretty made clear who the Jewish leaders think he is. Who do they think he is? They think he's somebody from Satan. They're ready to have him killed. They're already plotting. It's pretty obvious what they think of him. But Jesus is interested in the common people, the man, the crowds, the ones that he's been tending to, the ones they've been feeding. That's who he wants to know how they think. But look, in this matter of Jesus' identity, who is Jesus? Who is this man? For the first 9 chapters, 8.5 chapters, I guess you could say, the identity of Jesus has been a theme that Luke has been pushing from the very beginning. Who the identity of Jesus? Remember, Luke is writing to, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think, if I remember this right, Luke was writing primarily to Gentiles, primarily to Greeks, who had to identify with gods and identities and that sort of thing. So Luke is pushing the identity of who Christ is in his writing. We see it from the very beginning in Luke chapter 2, the birth narrative. Chapter 3, that John the Baptist denied he was the Christ and pointed towards Jesus. The demons in chapter 4, they identified who Christ was as the Holy One of God, the Son of God. In chapter 5, the theme surfaced again when Jesus forgave the paralytic sins and scribes and Pharisees. Who is this? Who is this man? That question again. The same question when he forgave the sinful woman in chapter 7. When he stilled the storm. We just read about it, studied a couple of weeks ago, when he stilled the storms. And the disciples all ask, who is this man that he tells the winds and the waves and they obey him to be still? Herod, last week, Herod raised the question, who is this? So that question of who is this is something that Jesus' identity is something that has been a theme that Luke has been working on, building, trying to find out who Jesus was. Who is this man? All right, so he asked the simple question, who do the people say? Now he gets a little more personal. Now he's getting more personal with just the 12. Notice what he asked there in verse 20. But who do you say that I am? Brings it on home. Who do you say that I am? Jesus is not interested in so much in hearing the commentary from the general public. Yes, he wants to know what they're saying. But who is he guiding, helping lead and guide to prepare them for his coming death? It's those 12. It's those 12. He's getting them ready for what they're about to have to go through. Helping them to accept who Christ really is, and are they willing to make the sacrifice for what's coming. He's wanting to cause them to face the issue, really face the issue of who his identity truly is and help them grasp that understanding. Because at this point, did they really truly know? They acknowledge him as the Christ, the Son of God, the living God, as the Messiah. But in their human minds, what were they still expecting? A king, an earthly king. They still hadn't grasped that this kingdom that he was talking about was a heavenly kingdom. It wasn't an earthly kingdom. So he's trying to get them to that. So what was Peter's response? We're all familiar with it. What was Peter's response when he says, who do you say that I am? Who do you say? So I said, the Son of the living God. If you look over in Matthew chapter 16, Matthew gives us a lot more detail of what Peter actually said there. Luke kind of condenses it for us here. But Matthew gives us the whole detail of what he said there. In Matthew 16, in verse 16, he says, Simon Peter answered and said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's the great confession that the church was built upon. That's the confession that we make when we become obedient. And what was Jesus' response to him? Exactly. That's the great confession. Things are changing. Things are fixing to go in a different direction in the ministry of Christ here with this confession. The Christ of God. It's a turning point. It's a turning point in the ministry of Christ. It's a turning point in the book of Luke here.
Andy, that statement had to be made for the rest of it to carry on.
It did. Absolutely. Jesus needed to know that they would say that. They had to make that confession. You're absolutely right. In order for Christ to build his church, that confession is what he's on. It had to be made. It's a very important statement so far in Luke. Probably the most important statement that we've read so far in Luke. Because it's the first time that the disciples have referred to Jesus as the Messiah. This is the first time they've referred to him and realized that he is the Messiah, the Christ. That wasn't his name. What is that word Christ? The Christ of God. The word Christ means anointed. They were acknowledging, Peter with that confession was acknowledging he is the anointed one sent from God. is what he was acknowledging there with that vision. So, the traditional view of the Messiah was someone that was going to do what? Was just merely a man. That's what the crowd thought. That's what the crowds, the multitudes, he was just merely another man, albeit an extraordinary man, and extraordinary gifts. But the view did not do justice to the Old Testament passage which identified the coming. We go back to Isaiah chapter 7 and chapter 9, Micah chapter 5. We see these prophecies of the coming Messiah. Peter had come to realize that Jesus was one far greater than just your normal man. Peter finally was beginning to realize that, see that through Christ. That he was both Messiah and the Son of God. The Pharisees and Sadducees, they refused it. They rejected it altogether. They didn't. And the majority of the crowd accepted him as who? The majority of the crowd accepted Jesus as just another prophet. That was their mindset. Why? They were waiting on that earthly king. They couldn't get past that. They were waiting on an earthly king. All right, let's look at. Let me go back. All right, so Peter has confessed that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus commended. We go back to Matthew's account. Jesus commended him for that and told him, flesh and bones have not revealed this to you, but that my Father in heaven. So Peter is commended for that. Then he says in verse 21, and he strictly warned and commanded them to tell this to no one. Why? They just went about, he just sent them out all over the region, preaching and teaching the gospel of the coming kingdom. Why did he tell them now to tell no one? What do you think his reason was? Why the silence of his identity? I mean, the demons announced it. They knew who he was. On different occasions, they recognized immediately who Christ was. The reason for the silence. Why? What do you think?
Because when people realized who he was, they were going to do exactly what they did. Kill him.
Right. Exactly. That would have impeded his path to the cross. They would have gotten in his way. He had to get to that cross, didn't he? He had to make it to the cross. And that would have just made it so much more difficult if people would have realized that. Jesus has commanded Peter's confession. He made it clear that his conclusions were not prompted by men. If you go to Matthew 16, he says, it wasn't flesh and blood that made this known, but my Father in heaven. They were convinced from within by taking words and the works. But secondly, just like he said, he wanted to avoid arousing a big stir. Ill-conceived hopes that this was a political Messiah. Remember, the people were looking for a political king, someone to come in and take over Rome and destroy Rome. And so he didn't want people thinking, all right, well, our earthly king has arrived. Misconceived ideas. To identify with their era, their views that this was an earthly messiahship. So he wanted them to keep it quiet for the time. So, do you think that was hard for them to comprehend?
I mean, we have the whole blueprint
We do.
right here. Maybe in our own minds we give them a hard time for not believing that he was what he said he was. Put ourselves in that place where all they had known for 1,000 years was all coming to an end.
Yeah.
So the new plan was coming. To put ourselves in that place where how we
Exactly. Everything they had known their whole lives was about to end. Their idea, their concept that they had grown up being taught that there would be a Messiah coming, that he would reign again on David's throne, right there for them to physically see and destroy Rome. All that concept they were having to deal with, that all that was, it wasn't what they had believed or envisioned that it was going to do. And so here, Peter makes the confession that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God, but then Jesus immediately tells him, "Great, Simon, I praise you for what you've just did, but don't tell nobody. Don't tell nobody." You can probably see the look on Peter's face of like confusion. Why? Why would they not? And then he goes on to tell them, saying in verse 22, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised the third day." Now, if we go to Matthew's account, did Peter take to that very well? No, he didn't, did he? Peter jumped up and said, "No, wait just a minute. That ain't going to happen. That ain't going to happen in what Jesus tell him. Get behind me, Satan. You're getting in the way. It's got to happen this way. It's got to happen this way." So you think about the excitement, the exhilaration, you know. We've just recognized this is the Christ, the Messiah, and he's commended them for it. They're correct. They're right. They've got it right. And then he turns around and tells them, "But you got to be quiet about it. It's not time yet." And this confession, you know, to tell them that I'm going to have to suffer. I'm going to have to die. It was beyond their grasp, don't you think? Would it have been beyond our grasp? Absolutely it would. It would have been beyond our grasp too. You know, here Jesus, the King of Israel, and he keeps speaking of his death. That's not what they were anticipating. They wasn't speaking about the king to come and then immediately be put to death. Exactly. It's kind of like what Andy said in his lesson this morning. You know, we want to rush it up. We want to rush it up so we can get it right then. You know, and we don't understand. We have our little finite minds of how things should be, and God's seeing the ultimate forever picture. And so this was probably something that was incomprehensible to him. How can this be taking place? How can he be the Messiah, he be the King of Israel, but yet then he's going to suffer and be put to death? So do you think they're even more confused now? Absolutely. Wouldn't we be? Absolutely. We at this minute in time, we think we've got it all figured out and we know where we're headed, and then all of a sudden he turns back around and says, "Wait just a minute. It ain't going to be that way. It ain't going to be that way." Jesus is preparing them for this. So it was just totally beyond their grasp, I'm sure, you know, that he was the glorious king, yet he keeps speaking about his death. He keeps referring to his death. He keeps referring to suffering and to dying. And so in verses 23 through 26, he kind of lays down the principle for true discipleship. He kind of, as we say, puts the rubber to the road here. This is it. If you want to be a true disciple of his, a follower of his, then this is what it's going to take right here. And he's preparing them for it. He's getting them ready for what is about to happen. He lays down this principle that those who would truly be his disciples, they got to be willing to give up their lives. Let's read what he says here. He tells them that he's going to be betrayed, he's going to suffer, he's going to be raised on the third day. Then he said to them all, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, fathers and of the holy angels. What's Jesus just told them?
Well, he just laid out the principle there for everything from now till eternity.
Exactly.
Falls on the principles there.
On those few words right there. If we're going to be true followers of Christ. Notice what he says there. If anyone desires. Have you ever desired to have something? Just had a desire for something? Man, I want that so bad. That's the kind of desire he's talking about here. I really want to be a follower of Christ. I want to be that. That's right.
Think about that now, because he said, "You will follow me, they will follow you." Now what? Deny himself first.
Mm-hmm.
First we got to deny ourselves, and then all the rules and things we have to deny all that.
Right. What does it mean to deny myself? When we read those words, when we hear those words spoken from the pulpit or Bible class, or we just read it, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily. What is that? What is that to deny yourself and to take up your cross daily? Do I like to be denied of what I want? I want the shiny things. I want the good things in life. I want the easy life. What does it mean to you, individually, personally, to deny yourself? Take up your cross. What does it mean to take up our cross? Right. Right. Doesn't say it's going to be easy, did he? Never easy. In Jesus' time, the cross crucifixion, the one thing they would do, they knew when he said, "Take up your cross and follow me," they knew exactly. They had a vision in their mind what he was talking about. Because someone who was crucified on the cross, that top beam was strapped on their back, and they had to carry it to where they were going to be nailed to it. So they walked through the streets carrying that cross on their backs. And everybody knew, and they knew what was coming when they got to the end. And so when he said, "Take up your cross and follow me," they had a very, very good vision of what was fixing to happen, of what it was going to take, the sacrifice that was going to have to be made. I don't think sometimes we today have that same picture in our heads of what it is to take up our cross and follow him, to be that true disciple. To be that true disciple. Any thoughts? Any comments on that? Because notice he says there, you may gain the whole world. Everything you ever want, everything you ever desire in this world, you may have it. But what have you given up to gain it? Why? What are the things in this world? The joys of this world are here. Eternity is as far as the east is from the west. Lose contentment. That's not where true contentment's found, in these things. And then I think it's look at verse 26. He says, "For whoever is ashamed of me," now it's not just ashamed of me, but ashamed of me in what? my words. How can we be ashamed of Christ and His words? What's the results of that? How can we be ashamed of Christ? You know, I may say, well, I'm not ashamed of Christ. I gladly profess Christ as my Lord and Savior. You think he's talking about those who just say, no, I don't want to have anything to do with it? Say, is that just the people he's talking about? Those who just say, well, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in Christ, I don't want to have anything to do with that religion. Is that the ones he's talking about that are ashamed of him? Who's he referring to there? Those who are ashamed of me and my words. Those that don't live for him.
And in John 12 and 48, he who rejects me and does not receive my words has that which judges him. The word that I have spoken will judge him in that last day. You don't say other things about his word. John 12:48. Clear it up.
Right.
He rejected his word too, and he is the word. So.
Right, we're rejecting him. Absolutely. We rejected. Keep my commandments. Yep. That's a good point. So he kind of puts it in there. If we want to be true disciples of Christ, if they wanted to truly follow him, like they were making claims, because there was Peter, you know, Peter jumped up and said, you know, and he does it again here in the Transfiguration, which we're probably not going to get to, but Peter does it twice. You know, Peter's one of those that like, well, don't just sit there, let's do something, you know, jump up and do it. But Peter's like, you ain't going to die, Lord. Don't even start talking about that. But what does Jesus tell him? No. If you're going to be my follower, you're going to have to suffer it too. You're going to have to suffer the rejection in this old world too. Any other thoughts? All right, well, so we have the background leading up to the Transfiguration. That's going to be in verses 27 through 36, and I don't know that we'll kind of touch on that, and then I'll let Tim pick it up from there. But the background is the Jewish leadership, they've rejected Jesus. They're plotting his death. That's what they're after. The vast majority of the Jews and those in the area, the Israel nation, Hebrew nation, they regarded Jesus as someone very highly. He was extraordinary. He spoke with authority from God, but not highly enough. They didn't recognize him as the Christ yet. The disciples, we see they believed him to be the Messiah, the Son of God, but vaguely they comprehended. I think they just had a vague comprehension of what was about to happen to him, the implications of what they professed. They really still didn't understand it. You got Jesus' praise of Peter, making that great confession that the church was built. He built his church on. But yet it's quickly nullified and said, okay, but you got to keep this to yourself right now. Because he was going to have to die, that responsibility. And that they was going to have to be willing to do the same thing if they wanted to be his true disciples. So were these matters, you still think, too deep for them? Would it have been too deep for us to understand? I think so. Let's like Phil said, let's don't be too hard on them. Everything that they knew up to this point was fixing to change. You know, was fixing to be turned upside down. And so we have this 8 days here. Verse 27, he says, but I tell you truly, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the kingdom of God. So he gives them a little hope there. He gives them a little hope. There's room for hope there that, you know, there may be some of them that actually see this kingdom of God. Again, where do you think their minds went? earthly kingdom. They were still clinging on to that with all hope of that earthly kingdom.
You know, that's you think about the mindset of Peter.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he couldn't believe Jesus. I mean, after all, he's the Christ. He's
Right.
the Son of God.
Exactly.
You know, he's not going to be killed. You know, that's just the mindset that Peter had.
Right.
It's like that. And Jesus, this whole time, was telling him,
It has to
that's
happen.
not what it's about. This is what
Right.
it's going to happen.
Right. Exactly right. Exactly right. So he gives them a little bit of hope there. And so it says it came to pass about 8 days after these sayings that he took Peter, John, and James and went up to the mountain to pray. We're going to stop right there. You know, it seems that we don't know what all happened in this 8 days, what all the discussion was. There was probably a lot of, I guess you could say a lot of, as we say sometimes, soul searching, considering what was just took place, what was said, what's about to happen. Jesus praying for his disciples. I think all this transfiguration that we're about to get into next week was designed for their benefit, to help them really see, to come to the understanding of who Jesus truly, truly was, to help build upon that confession that Peter made. Thank you for all your comments.